G'day mate, it's the Doctor here, and I've got a hot take for you. Oh yes, a controversial opinion. Clickbait, if you will. Ragebait, hatebait, masturbate. Wait, what? When Hit Entertainment took over in 2002, the series would take a nosedive in every aspect. The stories became lackluster, the dialogue was mundane, little to no continuity, boring music, flat sound effects, even visually the show took a hit. Twitter user RailRocket made a color correction edit on one of the episodes and look at it, doesn't it look more lively than the official version? But what if I told you, this era, which many would call deplorable, did something better than the Railway series?
Humph! That'll be the day.
Well, not to stir up another riot, but this is the day. And once I show you the evidence, you will never see this series the same way again. When dealing with an ensemble cast, it is vital that each member has their own story. Wilbert Awdry dedicated a book to each engine of the main fleet, and quite often their stories would carry over into other books. One common arc several of these characters would go through is prejudice towards diesel engines. But who can blame them? The first one they encountered intended to replace their kind, while also getting the steam engines to turn on each other. First impressions matter, and the reputation of diesels would be damaged by the first of many. But have you ever asked yourselves, when did this conflict come to an end? With Henry, he had Bear, a diesel who admired steam trains. With Duck and Gordon, they had Boko, a diesel who shared the same opinion of the two, how Bill and Ben are mischievous little bees buzzing around. There was one character whose prejudice was left unresolved with the diesels, and that character was James the Red Engine. Until in 1984, when Christopher Awdry had taken over his father's mantle, the son of the creator released the 28th book in the series titled James and the Diesel Engines. This seemed like a natural addition for the Railway series, a loose plot thread finally tied up to give James the necessary character development he has been lacking up until this point. It's worth noting, James's book plays out almost beat for beat as Thomas's book despite only being the third entry in the Railway series. There was never an end goal with his character as the Reverend was rushed to finish James's book, so there wasn't enough time for him to plan a character arc for James. So, for Christopher to mend the character and to flesh him out like all the rest seemed like a wonderfully clever idea. Sadly, this book has been received as one of the worst entries in the entire series. How could this be? Why the negative reception? Well, let's take a look for ourselves. Chapter 1: Old Stuck-Up. Our story begins with Boko showing a new diesel around Sodor. He's disgusted to find out he would be sharing a shed with steam engines, and tells Boko directly in front of them, steam engines are outdated objects. The next day, he attempts to steal Boko and Bear's fuel supply for the journey home, only to slip on the tracks and crash through the shed wall. He is sent packing the next day, never to be seen again. Alright, we're already dealing with familiar territory here, as this story is nearly identical to the final chapter in the Stepney book, Bowled Out. Pompous Diesel arrives on Sodor, talks rudely about the steam engines in front of him, makes a fool of himself, and disappears as soon as he was introduced. Though whereas Bowled Out was the last chapter in the Stepney book, this one is the first, and to be fair, it sets up everything. Diesels are still rude, which reignites James's prejudice towards them. Not a great start, but it gets the job done. Also, for the sake of this video, we'll be using the word prejudice instead of the alternative, as YouTube prefers English speakers not to speak in their native language. Chapter 2: Cross Lines. James continues his vitriolic language towards the diesels, and it's getting to the point where the other engines are giving up trying to reason with him. Later, he is shunting some well wagons in a nearby yard until his train was ready. A signalman confuses James for another engine and accidentally sends him onto the wrong track, which causes James to crash as he was too busy sulking to pay attention. I see what's going on. James is acting like an old stuck-up himself and faces his comeuppance as a result. It's a nice parallel to the first story. The final page emphasizes the importance of a signal, and its loss was a massive inconvenience. Let's see what this leads to. Chapter 3. Fire Engine. The engines are talking about their paintwork, with Henry telling James he is like a fire engine. He snaps back at Henry, rudely remarking on his paintwork how it blends into the background. Henry becomes reckless that day, bumping his coaches around, causing him to break the coupling to his tender. They drop his fire so he doesn't boil dry, while Edward tells the others what had happened. James notices from then on, Henry never teased him about fire engines ever again. Did we step into a filler episode? What on earth does this have to do with the rest of the book? There's no mention of signals, or diesels, you know, the core focus of the book. How does this chapter build upon the first two? I'd like to say this is leftovers from Henry and the Express, except that book came out much later, and this story completely halts the progression of what is meant to be a pivotal moment in the series. You're losing me, Christopher. Chapter 4. Deep Freeze. Winter has arrived on Sodor, and James was taking on water when the fireman forgot to tell the driver to turn the tap off. The water overflows into James's tender, which didn't seem to concern James's crew until his ejector failed after they began their journey. James is worried if they dropped his fire then Henry would never let him down, so the fireman explains it will just damp his fire, which... how would you do that? I thought his ejector failed because there was a blockage in his pipes caused by frozen water. Whatever the case, a works diesel is called in to take James to be repaired. The book mentions James and the works diesel were chatting like old friends, and the book ends with James admitting diesels can be useful too. So, few questions. Why is the identity of a works diesel hidden from the reader? Why is it not any of the diesels established in Chapter 1? Why is it not another diesel we know, like Mavis, Daisy, Rusty, Salty? Oh wait, Salty wasn't in the Railway series.
Weigh anchor, laddie!
The final chapter is so vague in its writing, it comes across as lazy. With the other two diesels, we know what they said in their conversations with the other characters, giving us an understanding of their connection. But here, we have no idea what these two discussed. Was that the point of Fire Engine? Is that what they talked about? Is the purpose of this works diesel meant to be left up to audience interpretation? Trust me, that's a bad idea. I'm just baffled by the direction of this book. Really? This is how Christopher wanted to resolve James's character arc? Just... ugh! But you want to know the real kicker? You want to know the cherry on top of this oily cake? In the first page of the first chapter, it specifically mentions James likes Baramboco. So he's already aware not all diesels are bad? Why would you dedicate an entire book to James's character arc if you're going to resolve his arc on the first page? When did James take a liking to Bear and Boko? How did he warm up to not one but two diesels? Why does the very next chapter contradict this by stating James never liked diesels? This isn't Audrey written material, this is Miller written material! I can't believe this out of hand in the Railway series! So, James's arc with the diesels was pretty bad. What about the trucks? This is where things get juicy. The troublesome trucks are a bunch of rambunctious miscreants that enjoy causing damage and destruction at any given opportunity. They don't usually carry names, so there wasn't much incentive to characterize these violent offenders. In all three timelines, James's story on Sodor begins with a terrible crash because some trucks got the better of him. From there, he would be involved in plenty of incidents, so it's safe to presume he has as much trust in the trucks as the diesels. But one timeline expanded on this conflict better than all the rest. It might have been the model era, but it was not the classic era that explored this character arc in greater depth, and James's prejudice wouldn't be tested until the 5th episode of the 11th season, Hector the Horrid. The episode begins with Thomas the Tank Engine shunting trucks around in the yard, proving to everyone how good he was at the job. Suddenly, Bill and Ben rattle into the yard with a new truck biffing and bashing them around. Thomas questions why one truck needs 2 engines, with Ben explaining he doesn't like to be shunted, and Bill follows up by telling Thomas they call him Hector the Horrid. Interestingly, James is present in this scene, and takes notice how troublesome the new truck looks to be. After all, Bill and Ben handle trucks all the time, and now a new truck is giving both twins trouble? James has every right to be cautious about the new guy. Thomas boasts that trucks don't worry him, and he can biff Hector into place. It's worth mentioning, Hector the Horrid is a Thomas-centric episode, which was another problem with the Hit era, having Thomas hogging all the spotlight to himself, barely allowing other characters to shine through. But what is James's role in this story? We'll cross that bridge eventually. Thomas later meets Hector at another yard where Bill and Ben brought him, and is hesitant now, staring into the face of the largest truck he's ever seen. He proceeds to shunt him.
Keep away!
Excuse me, loud cow. We don't tolerate that kind of mouth. You don't have authorization to control me. Only Sir Topham Hatt has the authority.
Keep away!
Thomas decides to fill up other trucks he felt comfortable in handling. All the while, Hector the Horrid was watching him. The plant manager walks in, and explains to Thomas Hector is a necessity for the long train of trucks.
We need an extra large delivery. You must shunt and fill Hector, then add him to the back of James's train.
Excuse me, Mr. Manager. I can't help but notice your yard has fallen to disarray over the years. May I suggest you stand by your title and do a better job managing your yard? Or are you busy having a medical episode? Thomas makes his way back onto the track, with Rosie rolling up beside him. She's excited to help out Thomas at first, but unbeknown to the sweet, innocent, defenseless little engine,
Hector opened his mouth and let out the biggest roar ever.
This was the breaking point Thomas needed. A fight breaks out between Hector the Horrid and Thomas the Tank. He pops himself full of rage and tells the beast of a brute, "That's my missus you scared off, mate. I'm gonna belt your face in for that." Hector, committed to his repetitive tactics, believes that repeating the same offensive maneuvers will result in a different outcome.
Get away from me!
You, sir, have caused confusion and delay. You deserve a walloping, you wallaby! Thomas goes up to Hector, now laying in the pits, and asks him why he is the way he is. To which we find out Hector is a sympathetic villain because he was scared to be filled up with coal. It's worth mentioning, this episode came out around the time we started seeing the rise in popularity of sympathetic villains, stories about evil we are meant to empathize with, understanding the reasons for their unreasonable actions. Like this episode that all came out around the early 2010s. Yes, I'm allowed to say that. I don't know about you, but I've gotten sick of this trope. I prefer unapologetic villains, the type of scum that have nothing redeeming to their name, and relish in their own cruelty they can inflict onto others. However, this was different for its time, and among other sympathetic villains in the series, I think Hector is one of the better ones. Thomas takes Hector to the coal hopper and proceeds to be filled up with coal himself, showing Hector there is nothing to worry about. Now the hopper car wants to try it out himself. The train is soon ready and just in time for James to come in and haul it away.
Well done, Thomas!
Notice James never questions how Thomas got Hector to behave. He quickly buffers up to his train and heads off. This lack of interest from James could be seen as an abrupt ending, but I have a feeling this was the writer's intention. Hector the Horrid, on its own, has been widely accepted as one of the best episodes of the Hit era, but what no one realizes is this is part 1 of 2 stories. I know, continuity in the Hit era, that's like a Nitrogen episode without a 3 strikes formula.
Stuff and nonsense.
But it's real, it exists, and it's called James Works It Out. The 12th episode of the 12th season takes place sometime after the events of Hector the Horrid, as Sodor has entered the winter season. It starts off with our main character shunting trucks around in the yard, proving to everyone how good he was at the job. Why am I detecting another case of plagiarism? His train is ready with Hector coupled to the back. He takes notice of the weather and advises James to speak to the yard manager. Now before we continue, let's go over how this episode addresses the continuity established from its predecessor. Point 1. Hector maintains his character growth. A lot of times around this period, a character would be taught a lesson only for that moral to be forgotten about and any chance of character development is squandered.
She won't do a thing I tell her. That's because you're a big bossy boiler. Emily didn't like being called a bossy boiler. I don't like being patient. We have a very important job to do.
Not with Hector. Hector the Horrid is no more. He is now Hector the Cooperative. Yeah, that doesn't roll off the tongue as well. Point 2. James is unaware Hector is a changed truck. At no point does he question Thomas how he got Hector to change his ways. Nothing is retconned here because it was never brought to James's attention. From his perspective, Hector is just the same as when he met him, and given his introduction with Bill and Ben, why should James listen to the Horrid Hopper? There is another point this episode earns that harkens back to the classic era, but we will talk about that shortly. Along the way, he is warned by several characters the weather is getting worse, and though he shows concern with Edward, when Hector speaks up, James reverts back to his old stuck-up self. Can you guess what type of episode this is?
1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out! 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out! 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out!
Sure enough, James finds himself stuck in a snowdrift after ignoring Hector's advice, but can you really blame him for the position he's in? Especially when you remember the motto the engines run by?
Every wise engine knows that you cannot trust trucks.
So given James's history with the trucks, the experience of others, his first impressions of Hector, the motto they run by, why should James have any reason to place his trust in the hands of a truck? But something happens in this desperate hour of need. James changes his ways. After realizing Hector was trying to help him, he tells James if they back up on the track and come down at full speed, they should be able to push the train through the snow. So they uncouple Hector from the train to gather enough distance between themselves, and James waits patiently for Hector to give the signal. They charge straight down at vigorous speed. The trucks brace themselves for impact as James and Hector smash them through the snow! Mr. Editor, I thought we warned you after Season 7 not to use archive footage. James arrives at Great Waterton safe and sound to the surprise of Thomas and Stanley. To which the proud Red Engine replies,
I wasn't worried. Hector helped me all the way.
And that makes 3 people I trust now, the Vat Controller, Hector the Cooperative, and my smart red paint. Nobody is smarter than my smart red paint! James Works It Out achieved something very few episodes around this time did. It created an arc. Season 12 is often criticized for being a lackluster send-off of the model era, and while that remains mostly true, it provided character growth for one of the most popular characters of the series while maintaining its continuity for the rest of the series. James can still have trouble with the trucks, but as long as you can show which ones are good and which ones are bad, that is how you fight prejudice towards other groups of people. I am going to make a rational argument that I think you will find indisputable. Hector is Hit's best character. He serves a unique role as an insight to a newly built truck and as a character arc himself that is carried over to another episode. A truck who prefers to be useful instead of troublesome? What a great discovery! But bear in mind that this is nothing new. It's been under our nose this entire time, and yet nobody talks about it. I think it's because James works it out as a season 12 episode, and like all the rest, it comes with the same caveats. Uncanny blending of CGI and models, repetitive dialogue, and of course the obnoxious 3 strikes you're out formula. But even with those hindrances, holding the episode back as one of the greater episodes, can you honestly say it's any worse than the way Christopher handled James's story? The problem with Christopher's book, well, aside from the overall structure that's more wobbly than a 40-minute game of Jenga, the moral was delivered at the start of the story, which isn't what you typically do in traditional storytelling. Now, you might be typing in the comments, Doctor, aren't you giving this episode too much credit? Thomas goes through the same arc as James. This is just a repeat, like the Railway series. This is where context matters. In part 1 of this story, Thomas was willing to cooperate with Hector. It's him who was at fault, who had his own reasons that had nothing to do with Thomas. In part 2, James is the one at fault because he refused to listen to Hector's advice. Not because he's had run-ins with Hector personally, it's because Hector is a truck, and in James's mind, one truck is as good as another. Where I would like to end this is to get a conversation going about the Hector arc. Does this make the Hector arc the best part about the hit era? Is it up there with other fantastic arcs from the classic era? Whatever you think of this revelation, we can all agree on one thing. It's a better story arc than Henry and the Wishing Tree. And that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. These last few months have been experimental for my channel, and I intend to make videos like these the primary focus for the channel. 2024 is shaping to be the biggest year to date for the channel, so please like, share, subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And until next time, take care, mates.